Welcome back to part 2 of improving your aerial video, and I'm going to talk about camera settings. I was supposed to talk about camera settings and how to fly, but I will make another video about how to fly. First talk about GoPro. So I use Protune, flat picture profile, camera raw, resolution is at 2.7K, 30 FPS, sharpness is low, and FOV is at medium, and I use NTSC. Flat picture profile and camera raw and sharpness at low, that is if you are going to do color correction. If you are not, then you should have Protune off and just have the default settings. I will make a video about color correction and editing later. But I'm not an expert at color correcting, but I am able to at least get a decent result, I think. Let's talk about cameras you can set in manual mode. So, the basics. The less the aperture, the lower the aperture, the more light you will get in your video, but also less can be in focus at the same time. This is also useful if you want the background to become very blurry and hide the background. The ISO also controls the amount of light you get. The lower the ISO, usually that is better because you will get less noise. The higher the ISO, the more light you get, but also the more noise you get in the video. The shutter speed should be twice as fast as your FPS. So if you have FPS at 30, your shutter speed should be on at 60. Too high shutter speed will cause stuttering in your video. You should always use NTSC and not PAL. Well, for the most part. Sometimes in very low light conditions you will want to use PAL, just because with PAL is 25 frames per second and not 30, and therefore your shutter speed can go down to 25. So the slower your shutter speed is, the more light you will be able to get in your video. The problem with both 25 FPS and 30 and the slow shutter speed at 30 or 25 is that you get a lot of motion blur in your video. Therefore, you should try to keep the movements to a minimum. The problem also with PAL is that your computer monitor and Vimeo and YouTube and so on is set up for NTSC and not PAL. Therefore, with PAL, you will get stuttering. The only reason to use PAL will be if you are going to make video for a TV production or something like that, and you are in a PAL country, or in Europe. If you set the aperture to, let's say, f22 to get the right exposure, then you can get a very blurry image. So in bright daylight it can be a problem to reduce the amount of light. You should consider getting a filter for your lens. Some people might say that it can ruin your gimbal, but I don't think so. Just try to find a light filter and then rebalance your gimbal. If you have a light meter, the easy and safe thing to do is to point your camera on the ground and set your settings on your camera so that the light meter is on 0. It is, however, beneficial to get as much light in your video as possible up to the point of overexposure, because you can just turn down the brightness and still retain the details from the shadows. But the areas that are overexposed, you will not be able to retrieve any details from. So if you have a white cloud that is overexposed, maybe that's not a problem. It is better to be able to retrieve details from the shadow than from the white cloud. If you can turn on zebra patterns in your camera, they will tell you the areas that are overexposed. I can't tell you the best settings for the GH4 or the Nex5n when it comes to the detailed settings, but my settings is in the video description. If you Google Nex5n or the GH4 flat picture profile, you will find many opinions and a lot of information, so test them out and see for yourself what you like best. In the next video I will talk about how to fly, so until then, have a safe flight and happy flying!